Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to follow on from my video earlier in the week about the government plans to further accelerate the privatisation of the NHS and look at how the Health Secretary driving these policies has a potentially huge conflict of interest over the issue. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So much of the Conservative Party, of course, is not in favour of the NHS. They want a largely unregulated, fully privatised system of healthcare. That still shouldn't mean that they pursue such a policy in government, because they always promise to defend the publicly funded model in their election campaigns. But anyone paying attention to politics knows that the Tories are all about privatising healthcare. Privatising everything, quite frankly. It's part of their political philosophy. You know, anyone voting Tory thinking that they won't increase the levels of privatisation are like the frog giving the scorpion a lift across the river. But it's one thing to be pursuing your political ideology in power, albeit dishonestly, but it's quite another if you are deciding on policies that personally line your pockets. That is corruption in anyone's book. That's not an issue of left or right, that's just wrong. One of the reasons why any sort of business activity for MPs generally, but cabinet ministers specifically, is that you are forming policy that inevitably either helps or hinders certain business interests. It is absolutely vital that our government makes those policy decisions based upon what they believe is best for the country. As a result, there really shouldn't be any money linking those government ministers and those business interests. Now, people of different political persuasions can agree or disagree on what is best for the country, but the policy should be driven by that belief, not personal gain. I mean, really, that shouldn't even need to be said, should it? So now let us imagine, hypothetically for now, that the Health Secretary is pushing for the greater use of artificial intelligence in the health service, which he is. Well, that makes sense. Part of modernising healthcare. Absolutely. But then let us also say that the same Health Secretary also has shares in a company that produces artificial intelligence solutions for the healthcare sector. Ooh, might there be a possibility that he pushes his policy not in the best interests of patients or healthcare practitioners, but in the commercial interests of the company in which he just so happens to have shares? After all, if that company gets a lot of business from his policies, he gets more in terms of dividends, because they make more profit, he gets more money. In other words, the Health Secretary could stand to gain financially from policy decisions that he makes. That right there is a potential conflict of interest. And this is a man, bear in mind, Sajid Javid is a man who has a history of engaging in tax avoidance schemes. He's someone who has, in the past, arranged his financial affairs to suit him rather than the country, at the cost of the country. Because yes, people say tax avoidance is legal. Yeah, of course it is, because politicians like himself make it so. But it still represents a way of depriving the Treasury. It's arranging your financial affairs so that you don't pay the tax that you normally have to pay. That the tax that the rest of us would have to pay, you don't. And it deprives us of the public services which need those taxes to fund them. So I'm going to suggest that I would be suspicious of any politician, no matter what I thought of them, even some of the good ones. I'd be suspicious of any politician who had such a conflict of interest. If they were forming policy on the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare and they had shares in a company that provides artificial intelligence solutions for healthcare, I'd be suspicious of that. But if someone of Javid's financial history, I really don't think there's any sensible way to give him the benefit of the doubt. And it's with this in mind that Labour's Angela Rayner has written to the Prime Minister's ethics advisor to explain whether or not Javid's conflict of interest represents a breach of the ministerial code. Now, just to be clear, the ethics advisor, Lord Geit, is not independent or apolitical. Rayner has not written to him to actually seek a view on this. We know it's a breach of the ministerial code, and I'll explain how it clearly is. Because some people, less cynical than myself, may imagine that, well, you know, as long as Javid doesn't actually act in the interests of this country in which he has shares, then there's no problem, is there? Not the case. Boris Johnson himself writes in the ministerial code document that there must be no actual or perceived conflicts of interest. Perceived. So there's no argument about whether or not Javid would prioritise the good of our healthcare systems or the company whose performance pays him dividends. Even a perceived conflict of interest is not permitted. Owning shares in a company whose profits will be affected by your policy decisions as Secretary of State for the sector that company operates in, and it does operate in the UK because it's a California-based company, but it does operate in the UK, that at the very, very least is a perception of a conflict of interest. And a Prime Minister that was serious about the words that they themselves wrote and the code that they approved would take immediate action. So Rayner is writing to Geit not to query whether or not it is a breach, but to expose yet more corruption. Geit wasn't made Johnson's ethics advisor because he's an expert. He's got no background in ethics, he's a diplomat. More importantly, he was a Tory who was good at writing reports. So he is employed to write reports in such a way as to find ministers blameless of breaches of the ministerial code, even when they're as guilty as sin. In a functioning democracy, of course, a job like that should be quite light. It'd be like, oh, your job is to adjudicate whether ministers have broken the ministerial code. Well, that can't be much work. In fact, it should be a pretty easy job. But under Boris Johnson, I think he's kept fairly busy. He's even had to write reports finding his boss not guilty of clear breaches of the ministerial code. So he will inevitably conclude that Javid isn't guilty either. But in doing so, he will have to expose further corruption in government. Boris Johnson's diluted second jobs motion last week was designed to persuade people that he'd finally dealt with the issue of corruption. He knew that most of the media would not provide a critical analysis to their readers or viewers. Johnson wants people to say, well, yes, he dropped the ball a couple of times, but he came good in the end. Labour need to show those same people that they haven't done anything at all, in fact, that they're still up to their tricks. Because you know Rayner's opening statement in the letter, she says, I am writing to you yet again regarding what appears to be a breach of the ministerial code by a cabinet minister. Now, it's impossible for anyone not to read her letter and conclude that Javid doesn't have a perceived conflict of interest, at least. And her use of the term yet again lets anyone reading the letter who's maybe not keeping up with things go, oh, this isn't just about Sajid Javid. She's apparently had to write lots of letters. Ooh, what's going on here? So there's been numerous issues amongst the government already. In fact, the letter doesn't even have all of the damning details that it might. There was a report in The Guardian that showed that Javid doesn't just have shares in this company. He was paid by this company, as well as being given the shares. It says he was paid the equivalent of £150,000 a year. Now, equivalent of pro rata because he hasn't worked for them for a full year. The employment was from last October up until when he was made Health Secretary in June. But he was made... So basically, that's about 8 months worth. With being paid a salary of 5 times the national average as a second job. It was Javid's role in the company, apparently. So what are they paying him for? He was supposed to advise them on market opportunities. I'll bet it was. Obviously, he would have had to give up the job on becoming Health Secretary, but he retains the shares that also formed part of his package, which Javid registers as having a value of £45,000. Now, in defence, all his department was able to say is the Secretary of State has acted in line with the ministerial code and has properly declared these share options in the usual way. But declaring a conflict of interest doesn't stop it being a conflict of interest. The ministerial code doesn't say it's all right as long as you declare your conflict of interest. It allows no room for manoeuvre. It says ministers must scrupulously avoid any danger of an actual or perceived conflict of interest between their ministerial position and their private financial interest. This is as clear a breach as you could imagine. Unfortunately, nothing will be done to prevent the conflict of interest being acted out. At best, absolute best, if this manages to get noticed amongst key sections of the public, and I fear it won't, Javid may be forced to sell his shares. But he's already been paid a fortune by the company, and so he will still intend to favour them later on. Because that's how it works. Whether he makes any further money from them or not. In fact, it would still have been a conflict of interest even if he didn't have the shares, because he's been paid by them. Even if he doesn't stand to gain any more financially from it, he needs to show potential future employers, other companies, that when you pay a government minister, if it's in the Tory party, they'll have your back even after you've stopped paying them. But he won't be sacked, as required by the code. So the need for this action from Labour and similar action from the SNP over the Cash for Honours scandal is less about stopping it, which they can't do without a parliamentary majority. I think it's more about exposing the rampant and quite blatant levels of corruption in the government in order to cost them that majority. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.